Sometimes, the smallest choices decide who keeps everything and who loses it all. The room was silent, but not the kind of silence that felt calm. It was tight, heavy, the kind that pressed against your chest and made even the ticking of a watch sound too loud. Ethan Caldwell sat at the head of a long glass table, his fingers resting lightly beside a stack of documents, his expression unreadable as 12 executives avoided his eyes. Outside, Manhattan moved like it always did. Horns, footsteps, ambition, but inside this room, time had slowed to a near stop. "Who had it last?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, sharper than any raised tone. No one answered. A man to his left adjusted his tie. Another cleared his throat. The contract, one sheet among many, but worth millions, was gone. And with it, the deal that would either save the company or quietly begin its collapse. Ethan didn't move. Didn't need to. Power rarely did. But his eyes shifted, one by one, measuring, calculating, remembering. Because just 24 hours earlier, none of this had been a problem. 24 hours earlier, he had been somewhere else entirely. Warm light, polished wood, the soft clink of glasses. A place where people came to forget stress, not create it. And in that place, something small had happened. Something no one noticed. Except her. Clara Whitmore moved between tables with quiet precision, her steps light, her posture steady after 8 hours on her feet. A black apron tied neatly at her waist, sleeves rolled just enough to keep her hands free. She didn't rush. Didn't need to. Everything she did had a rhythm. Measured, efficient, almost invisible. People liked servers like that. The kind who didn't interrupt. The kind who blended into the background. She set down a glass of water, refilled a napkin, adjusted a chair slightly so it aligned with the table. Small things. Always small things. And then she saw it. A wallet. Dark leather. Expensive, but not flashy. It slipped from the edge of a booth seat and landed softly against the polished floor with a sound too quiet for anyone else to hear. The man who dropped it didn't notice. He was already walking toward the exit, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and impatient. "No, push the meeting. I'll review it tonight," he said, already halfway out the door. Clara paused, just for a second. Her eyes moved from the wallet, to the door, to the space he had just left behind. Around her, the restaurant continued. Laughter, conversations, the low hum of a city that never stopped needing something. No one else had seen it. No one else had even looked down. She bent slowly, picking it up with both hands. It was heavier than she expected. Inside, there would be cash. Cards. Maybe more. Things people didn't usually get back once they were gone. For a moment, she just held it there. Still. Quiet. Thinking. Then she exhaled softly, closed it without opening it, and looked toward the door again. The man was already gone. But not far. Not yet. Clara straightened. Her fingers tightened slightly around the wallet. And then, without another thought, she stepped forward, toward the exit, toward the noise of the city, toward a decision that no one in that room would ever realize had already begun to change everything. The door opened with a soft chime, and the noise of the street rushed in like a wave that never asked for permission. Car horns echoing down the avenue. Footsteps quick and purposeful, the distant rumble of a subway beneath concrete and steel. And Clara stepped into it without hesitation, her grip steady around the wallet as her eyes scanned the sidewalk ahead, searching for the man in the tailored coat who had already begun to disappear into the rhythm of the city. Because in a place like this, people did not linger. They moved, they merged, they vanished, and for a moment, she almost lost him in the crowd of dark suits and hurried faces. But then she saw him again, just past the corner, still on his phone, his voice sharper now, more urgent. The kind of tone that made people step aside without realizing why. And Clara quickened her pace, her shoes tapping against the pavement, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to close the distance between them, her breath steady, her focus clear. Because this was not about attention or recognition, it was about finishing something she had already decided the moment she picked it up, and as she reached the edge of the crosswalk, the light shifted, cars slowing, pedestrians surging forward, and he stepped into the street without looking back, still speaking, still thinking about something far removed from the simple object missing from his pocket. And Clara followed, weaving through the movement with quiet determination until she was close enough to hear him clearly. "No, I said tonight. I do not want revisions tomorrow. I want answers, he said. And then, just before the signal changed again, she spoke, her voice calm but firm, cutting through the noise without needing to be loud. Sir, you dropped this. And he stopped. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough for the moment to register, his conversation pausing mid-sentence as he turned slightly, his eyes landing first on her face, then on the wallet in her hand, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered there, surprise, maybe, or confusion, as if the idea that something lost could simply be returned did not fit into the patterns he was used to. And he ended the call without another word, slipping the phone into his coat as he reached for the wallet, his fingers brushing against hers only briefly before he pulled it back, opening it quickly, almost instinctively, scanning the contents with a precision that spoke of habit, not curiosity, and Clara watched without expression, not intruding, not explaining, just waiting, because the decision had already been made, and she did not need anything from him to complete it. And after a moment, he exhaled quietly, the tension in his shoulders shifting, subtle but real, as his eyes moved again, this time back to her, more focused now, more present. You found this inside? He asked, his voice lower than before, and she shook her head slightly. No, I did not open it, she said, simple, direct, nothing more. And that seemed to land differently, the kind of answer that did not invite questions but left an impression anyway. And for a second, the city continued around them, indifferent, relentless, while something unspoken settled between two strangers who had no reason to meet and no expectation to remember each other. And then he nodded once, a small gesture, controlled. Thank you, he said, and it sounded genuine, not practiced, not transactional, just a recognition of something rare, and Clara gave a slight nod in return, already stepping back, already letting the moment in the way it was meant to, quiet, complete, without weight, without attachment, and as she turned to walk back toward the restaurant, disappearing into the same current she had stepped out of, neither of them realized that what had just been returned was not just a wallet, but something far more fragile, something that, if lost, would have cost far more than either of them could see yet. Clara did not look back as she stepped through the restaurant door again, the soft chime fading behind her as the warmth of the room wrapped around her shoulders, the familiar scent of coffee and polished wood settling her breath back into its quiet rhythm, and within seconds, she was already moving again, lifting a tray, refilling a glass, adjusting a table that had shifted half an inch out of line, because for her, moments like that did not linger. They passed, they folded into the rest of the day, and she returned to work as if nothing had happened, as if the city had not paused for even a second just outside those doors. And yet somewhere else, that pause had already begun to stretch into something much larger, because Ethan Caldwell did not move right away after she left. He stood there on the sidewalk for a moment longer than necessary, the wallet still open in his hand, his eyes scanning the contents again, slower this time, more deliberate, until they landed on a single, folded document tucked behind the inner sleeve, a page he had not realized was missing until now, a page that carried more weight than everything else combined, and his jaw tightened slightly as he pulled it free, unfolding it just enough to confirm what he already feared, the contract, the original draft, the one version that had not yet been digitized, the one that held handwritten notes, corrections, terms that had not been finalized, details that could not be recreated if lost, and for a brief second, the city noise faded, replaced by a quiet understanding that settled deep and heavy. Because without that page, the negotiation scheduled for the next morning would not just stall, it would collapse, and not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way things truly fall apart, quietly, behind closed doors, with consequences that ripple outward long after the moment has passed. And Ethan closed the wallet slowly, his fingers pressing against the leather as if grounding himself in something real, something that had almost slipped through his control without him even noticing. And he turned, instinctively, looking back toward the restaurant. But she was already gone, absorbed into the space she belonged to, just another figure moving behind glass and light, indistinguishable from the rest, and yet completely singular in the way she had just altered something he could not afford to lose. And for a man who measured risk in numbers and outcomes, this was something different, something he could not quantify. Because there had been no negotiation, no leverage, no expectation, just a simple act completed without hesitation, and that unsettled him more than the near loss itself. And as he slipped the wallet back into his coat, his phone buzzed again, the world returning to its usual urgency. "Ethan, we need confirmation on the terms before midnight," a voice said the moment he answered, and this time, his response was different, steadier, grounded in something that had shifted just slightly beneath the surface. "You will have it," he said, his eyes still on the restaurant window for a second longer before he turned away, stepping back into the current of the city with a pace that matched its demand. But his mind no longer entirely there, because somewhere between the sound of her voice and the quiet certainty in her actions, a question had formed, not about the deal, not about the company, but about the person who had walked away without leaving anything behind. And by the time night settled over Manhattan, casting long reflections across glass towers and empty streets, that question had not faded. It had only grown, waiting, quietly, for the moment it would be answered. By the time the city lights softened into a quiet glow behind glass towers, the conference room on the 42nd floor had not changed, but the energy inside it had. The same table, the same faces, the same tension. Yet now there was something else layered beneath it, something steadier, something grounded, and Ethan Caldwell stood at the head of the table once more, the missing document now resting exactly where it should have been, aligned with the others, precise, intentional, as if it had never left. But everyone in the room could feel that something had shifted, because earlier that morning, before the first call, before the first question, there had been uncertainty, quiet but dangerous, the kind that erodes confidence from the inside. And now there was clarity, not loud, not dramatic, just present, and that alone changed everything. "We proceed as planned," Ethan said, his voice even, controlled, leaving no space for doubt. And one by one, shoulders lowered, pens moved, decisions regained their direction. And within the hour, the deal that had hovered on the edge of collapse began to take shape again. Not perfectly, not easily, but firmly enough to hold, firmly enough to move forward. And when the final call ended and the room emptied, Ethan remained where he was, his gaze resting briefly on the document before shifting toward the window, the city stretching out beneath him, endless and indifferent. And for a moment, he allowed himself to stand still, not as the CEO, not as the decision-maker, but as the man who had come within inches of losing something he did not even realize he had misplaced. And it was not the contract that stayed with him, not the numbers, not the outcome, but the memory of a quiet voice in the middle of a crowded street, steady, certain, unclaimed, and that unsettled him in a way he could not easily explain, because in his world, everything had a cost, everything had a reason, everything connected to something else, and yet this had not. There had been no advantage, no expectation, no follow-up, just an action completed and released, and that absence of motive felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting, and he turned back toward the table, picking up his phone with a motion that was more deliberate than usual, scrolling briefly before stopping, then dialing. "Find her," he said when the call connected, his tone calm but unmistakably firm. "The waitress from last night, the one at the restaurant on Madison. I want her name." There was a pause on the other end, brief, acknowledging, "Understood," came the response, and Ethan ended the call without another word, placing the phone down as his eyes moved once more toward the city, because for the first time in a long while, something had entered his world that he did not control, something that did not follow the rules he had built his life around, and he was not used to leaving questions unanswered. Meanwhile, several blocks away, Clara Whitmore stepped out of the staff entrance, her shift finally over, the night air cooler now, quieter, carrying a different rhythm than the day, and she adjusted her coat, pulling it slightly tighter as she began her walk toward the subway, her steps unhurried, her expression unchanged, because for her, the day had ended the way most days did, work completed, tables cleared, nothing remarkable, nothing worth holding on to. And yet as she descended the stairs into the underground station, the sound of a train approaching in the distance, there was a brief moment, barely noticeable, where she paused, just for a second, as if something had brushed against her thoughts and moved on before it could fully form, and then she continued. disappearing into the flow of commuters, unaware that somewhere above, in a room of glass and steel, a decision had already been made that would bring her back into a world she had never asked to enter. The next morning did not begin with anything unusual, at least not on the surface, because Clara Whitmore arrived at the restaurant the same way she always did, stepping through the side entrance with 5 minutes to spare, tying her apron with practiced hands, and exchanging a quiet nod with the morning staff who had already started their routines, coffee brewing, chairs being set, menus aligned with almost ritual precision. And within minutes, she was moving again, her presence blending into the steady rhythm of breakfast service, orders taken, plates delivered, nothing out of place, nothing drawing attention, because that was how she preferred it, to work, to observe, to leave no trace beyond what was necessary. And for the first hour, the day unfolded exactly as expected, until it did not, because just before 10 o'clock, when the restaurant had begun to fill with the late morning crowd, the front door opened and something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for a few heads to turn, for a subtle pause to ripple through the space as a man in a dark suit stepped inside, followed by another, both scanning the room with a quiet focus that did not belong to casual diners. And Clara noticed it the same way she noticed everything, without reacting, without interrupting her movement as she set down a plate at table 7, her eyes lifting only briefly before returning to her task. But the shift did not fade. It settled, growing more defined as one of the men approached the host's stand and spoke in a low voice, measured, controlled, and within seconds, the manager appeared, his posture changing instantly, shoulders straighter, tone more attentive, the kind of response reserved for situations that carried weight, and Clara felt it then, not as concern, not as curiosity, but as a quiet awareness that something was about to step outside the normal pattern of her day. And when the manager's gaze moved across the room and stopped on her, holding for just a fraction longer than usual, that awareness sharpened. "Clara," he called, not loudly, but clearly enough to cut through the ambient noise. And she turned, placing the tray down before walking toward him with the same steady pace she used for everything else, her expression calm, unreadable. "Can you come with me for a moment?" he said, his voice carrying a hint of something unfamiliar, something closer to uncertainty than authority. And Clara nodded once, following him toward the front, her mind not racing, not speculating, simply present, because whatever this was, it would reveal itself soon enough. And as they reached the entrance, the man in the dark suit stepped forward, his eyes meeting hers directly, assessing, not unkindly, but thoroughly. "Miss Whitmore," he said, confirming rather than asking, and she gave a small nod. "Yes," and he gestured toward the door. "We would like you to come with us." The words were polite, but firm, carrying the quiet weight of a request that did not expect to be refused, and for a brief moment, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath, conversations lowering just slightly, attention shifting in ways that were not obvious but still present, and Clara stood there, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, because unlike the others in the room, she was not trying to understand what this meant in terms of status or consequence. She was simply recognizing that something had arrived, something that had followed her from the day before into this one, and after a second, she reached for her coat, slipping it on with calm precision, her movements unhurried, as if she had already accepted that whatever waited outside those doors was simply the next step in a sequence she had not tried to control. And as she stepped forward, passing through the threshold once more, the same soft chime marking her exit, the city greeted her again. But this time, it felt different, not louder, not faster, just closer, as if something within it had already begun to shift in response to a decision she had made without thinking twice. The car waiting at the curb was not extravagant in the way people expected wealth to look. There were no bright colors, no unnecessary details, just a black sedan with clean lines and windows dark enough to reflect the city back at itself. And one of the men opened the rear door with a quiet gesture, not forcing, not rushing, simply indicating that this was where she was meant to go. And Clara paused for half a second before stepping inside, her movements composed, her posture unchanged, because whatever this was, it had already moved beyond the point of avoidance. And the door closed with a soft, final sound that separated her from the street, from the restaurant, from the version of the day she had expected to have. And as the car pulled away from the curb, merging smoothly into traffic, the city shifted outside the window. Buildings passing in a steady rhythm, reflections sliding across the glass, and for a moment, neither of the men spoke, leaving the space quiet, controlled, intentional, and Clara sat still, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her gaze moving once across the interior before settling forward again. Because she did not fill silence unnecessarily, she let it exist until it had a reason to end, and eventually, it did. "You returned something yesterday," the man beside her said, his tone measured. Not accusatory, not overly polite, simply stating a fact that did not require confirmation, and Clara nodded once. Yes, and that was all she offered, because anything more would have been explanation, and explanation was not something she felt the need to provide, and the man observed her for a moment, as if expecting elaboration, then continued. "Do you know who that belonged to?" And again, she answered simply, "No." And this time, there was the slightest shift in the air between them, not tension, but recognition, because most people would have asked, would have tried to connect the event to something larger, something beneficial, but she had not. She had completed the action and stepped away from it, and that absence of curiosity carried its own kind of weight. And the car turned onto a wider avenue now, the buildings growing taller, the streets cleaner, quieter, the kind of area where decisions were made behind glass instead of spoken out loud, and Clara watched it pass. Without reaction, because environments did not change her. They simply revealed themselves, and after a few more minutes, the car slowed. Then came to a stop in front of a building that rose higher than the rest, its surface reflecting the sky in long, uninterrupted lines, and the door opened again. The same quiet gesture, the same expectation, and Clara stepped out, her shoes meeting the pavement with a soft, grounded sound as she looked up briefly, just enough to take in the height, the scale, the intention behind a structure built to command attention without asking for it. And then she lowered her gaze again, because awe was not something she carried with her, and the man gestured toward the entrance, this way. And she followed, walking through doors that opened before they reached them, into a lobby where the air felt cooler, cleaner, where every movement echoed slightly, contained within marble and glass. And people moved differently here, slower, more deliberate, voices lower, footsteps quieter, and yet Clara's pace did not change. Her presence did not shift to match theirs, because she did not adjust herself to fit a space. She remained as she was and let the space respond. Instead, and as they approached the elevators, one of them already waiting, already open, she stepped inside without hesitation, the doors closing behind them with a soft glide, and as the numbers began to rise, one after another, climbing higher, carrying her further away from the ground she had started on that morning, there was still no fear, no anticipation, just a steady awareness that whatever waited at the top had already been set in motion the moment she chose to do something most people would have ignored, and now, it was simply arriving. The elevator slowed almost imperceptibly before coming to a smooth stop, the soft chime echoing briefly in the enclosed space as the door slid open to reveal a floor that felt different from the ones below, quieter, more controlled, the kind of silence that did not come from emptiness but from intention, and Clara stepped out without hesitation, her gaze steady as she took in the surroundings. Glass walls stretching from floor to ceiling, offices arranged with precise symmetry, every detail aligned as if nothing here was left to chance, and the man beside her gestured forward once more, leading her down a corridor where footsteps seemed softer, absorbed into thick carpeting, voices distant, almost non-existent, until they reached a set of double doors that stood slightly apart from the rest, larger, heavier, designed not to impress but to define, and he paused there for a moment, turning to her with the same measured expression. "He is waiting," he said, and then he opened the door, stepping aside just enough for her to enter first, and Clara did, crossing the threshold with the same calm she had carried since the beginning. Because whatever this moment was, it did not change who she was. And inside, the room was wide and open, sunlight cutting across polished surfaces, a desk positioned near the far window, and behind it, standing rather than sitting, was Ethan Caldwell, his posture straight, his presence unmistakable even without introduction, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke. The space between them filled not with tension but with recognition, because this time, he was not looking past her, not distracted, not distant. His attention was fully there, focused, deliberate, and Clara stopped a few feet from the desk, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression unchanged, as if she had walked into any other room on any other day, and Ethan studied her for a moment longer, as if confirming something that had already been decided, before he spoke. "You returned my wallet," he said, not as a question, not needing confirmation, and Clara nodded once. Yes. And again, that was all she offered, because to her, the action did not require explanation, and for a moment, Ethan's gaze held, searching perhaps for something more, something hidden behind the simplicity of her answer. But there was nothing else there, nothing added, nothing performed, just the same quiet certainty she had carried the day before, and he exhaled slowly, stepping away from the desk, closing the distance between them just slightly, not to intimidate, not to assert, but to meet her on a more level ground. "Do you understand what was in it?" he asked, and Clara met his gaze without hesitation. "No," she said, and then after a brief pause, she added, "And it was not mine to understand." And that was the moment something shifted, not in the room, not in the air, but in him, because in a world where people constantly reached for more, for advantage, for explanation, she had drawn a boundary without effort, without resistance, simply by knowing where it belonged. And Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a rule he had not followed in a long time. And he turned slightly, gesturing toward the window, the city stretching out below them. "That document you returned," he said, his voice quieter now, more measured. "It was the difference between this company moving forward and losing everything we have built." And Clara listened, her expression unchanged, not impressed, not overwhelmed, just present, because for her, the scale of consequence did not alter the nature of the action. And after a moment, Ethan turned back to her, his eyes steady. "People in my position are used to paying for solutions," he continued. "We expect everything to have a price, a reason, a transaction." And he paused. There, just long enough for the words to settle. "But you did not ask for anything." And Clara's answer came just as simply as before, because there was nothing to ask for. And silence followed, not empty, but full, the kind that holds meaning without needing to fill it. And for the first time since she had entered, Ethan allowed a faint shift in his expression, not quite a smile, not quite relief, but something closer to respect, something earned without effort. And in that moment, the distance between them was no longer defined by position or title, but by something quieter, something far more difficult to measure. The understanding that sometimes, the smallest actions reveal the clearest truths about who a person is, and neither of them needed to say it out loud for it to be real. For a moment, neither of them moved, the quiet between them stretching just long enough to settle into something real, something that did not need to be filled with more words. And then Ethan turned slightly, walking back toward his desk with a measured pace, his fingers brushing lightly against the surface as if grounding himself in the familiar structure of his world. Because conversations like this did not follow the patterns he was used to. They did not end with numbers or signatures, or clear outcomes. And yet he understood that this moment required something more than acknowledgement. It required a response, and not the kind he usually gave, not the kind built on transactions or expectations, but something closer to recognition. And he picked up a thin envelope from the edge of the desk, holding it for a second before turning back to her. "In my world," he said, his voice steady but quieter than before, "gratitude is often expressed in a very specific way." And he extended the envelope toward her, not forcefully, not insistently, just offering it as something that made sense to him, something that completed the equation as he understood it. And Clara's eyes moved to the envelope, then back to him, her expression unchanged, her posture still, and she did not reach for it, not immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity, because to her, this was not the natural conclusion of what had happened. And the silence returned again, softer this time, more defined, as if both of them understood that this was the point where two different ways of seeing the world met and had to decide whether to bend or to hold. And after a second, Clara spoke, her voice calm. I did not return it for that, she said, and there was no resistance in her tone, no rejection. Just a simple statement that carried its own boundary, and Ethan held her gaze, the envelope still in his hand, as if measuring the weight of her words against everything he had learned to expect, and slowly, he lowered it, not withdrawing the offer, but acknowledging that it did not belong in this moment the way he had thought it would, and that realization did not frustrate him. It shifted something deeper, something quieter, because for the first time in a long while, he was not solving a problem, he was understanding one. And he set the envelope back on the desk without another word, his movements controlled but slightly altered, as if adjusting to a new balance he had not anticipated. And he looked at her again, this time not as someone who had done something for him, but as someone who had shown him something he had not seen clearly before. Then why did you return it? He asked, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as a genuine question, one that carried more curiosity than authority. And Clara answered without pause, without searching. Because it was yours, she said, and the simplicity of it landed differently than anything else that had been said in that room, because it removed everything unnecessary, everything layered on top of basic truth, and left only what remained when everything else was stripped away. And Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze shifting briefly toward the window, the city stretching endlessly below, full of motion, full of transactions, full of people constantly reaching for something more. And yet in that moment, the most significant thing that had happened to him in the past 24 hours had come from someone who had asked for nothing at all. And when he turned back to her, there was no calculation in his expression, no strategy, just a quiet decision forming, not about what to give, but about what to change. And for the first time since she had entered the building, Clara felt something shift as well, not in him, not in the room, but in the direction of what would come next, because this was no longer about what had already happened. It was about what would follow, and neither of them needed to say it out loud for it to begin. The question did not linger in the air for long, because Clara did not carry questions with her once they had been answered, and after a brief pause, she gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, as if acknowledging that whatever needed to be said had already been said, and then she shifted her weight slightly, not restless, not uncomfortable, just ready, because for her, moments had a natural end, and she did not hold on to them longer than necessary. And Ethan noticed that, the subtle readiness in her posture, the quiet indication that she was prepared to leave without waiting for permission, without asking what came next, and that, more than anything, clarified something for him. Because he was used to people staying, lingering, trying to extend moments in his presence, to turn a single interaction into something more, something beneficial, but she did not. She treated this the same way she had treated the moment on the street, complete, finished, without expectation, and that realization settled into place with a quiet certainty. And before she could turn, before the moment could close on its own, he spoke again. Wait. His voice not sharp, not commanding, just enough to pause her movement. And she did, turning back slightly, her gaze steady, and Ethan stepped away from the desk once more, this time not with hesitation, but with intention. If you will not accept payment, he said, his tone measured, then allow me to offer something else. And Clara watched him without reaction, not agreeing, not refusing, simply listening, because whatever he was about to say would stand on its own. And Ethan continued. You have already shown something that is rare, he said, choosing his words more carefully now. Not just honesty, but judgment, knowing what matters without needing to be told. And he paused briefly, as if weighing whether to continue, then did. That is something I do not ignore. And he moved to the side of the desk, picking up a folder this time, thinner than the envelope, more structured, and he held it in his hand, not extending it yet. I am offering you an opportunity, he said, not as a reward, not as a transaction, but as a choice. And Clara's eyes moved briefly to the folder, then back to him, her expression unchanged, but her attention fully there, because this was different from the envelope, different from something that could be taken or refused in a single motion. And Ethan placed the folder on the desk between them, opening it just enough to reveal the contents. A position, entry level on paper, but placed within a department where decisions were shaped, where movement led somewhere. where observation mattered as much as action. And he stepped back slightly, giving her space, not pressing, not explaining. Further, because he understood now that persuasion was not what guided her choices. And Clara looked down at the folder for a moment, her gaze steady, not scanning quickly, not reacting, just taking it in with the same quiet attention she gave everything else. And then she looked up again, meeting his eyes with the same calm presence. And for the first time since she had entered the building, there was a shift, subtle but real, not in her confidence, but in the direction of her thoughts. Because this was no longer about returning something. This was about stepping into something, and that required a different kind of decision, one that could not be made as simply as the last, and the room held that moment. Quiet, balanced, waiting, not for her to be convinced, but for her to decide, and Ethan did not interrupt it, did not fill the silence, because he understood now that whatever answer came next would not be shaped by him. It would come from the same place that had led her to run into the street without hesitation, and that was the only reason he trusted it would matter. Clara did not reach for the folder right away, and that hesitation was not uncertainty. It was consideration, the kind that moved quietly beneath the surface without showing itself too quickly, and she looked at it again, not as an opportunity, not as something to be taken or rejected, but as something that needed to be understood in its place, in its weight, in what it would ask of her if she chose to accept it. And for a few seconds, the room remained still, the city outside continuing its endless motion while inside. Everything seemed to pause around a single decision that did not need urgency to become important. And then she lifted her hand, not quickly, not slowly, just with the same steady intention she had carried from the beginning. And she opened the folder slightly more, her eyes moving across the first page, the words clear, structured, outlining a role that was simple in title but positioned in a way that suggested something else beneath it, something that was not immediately visible but present for those who paid attention. And Clara read without expression, not impressed, not overwhelmed, just observing. Because to her, titles did not define value, and opportunities did not define direction, only choices did. And after a moment, she closed the folder gently, her fingers resting on its surface for a second before she lifted her gaze back to Ethan, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged. And when she spoke, her voice was as calm as it had been from the beginning. "If I accept this," she said, not as a question, but as a condition, "it is not because of what happened yesterday." And Ethan listened without interrupting, because he understood that this was the part that mattered, not the offer, but the terms under which it would be accepted. And she continued, "It is because I choose to." And there was no emphasis, no need to strengthen the words, because their meaning was already clear. And Ethan nodded once, slowly, not agreeing, not conceding, but acknowledging, because that was exactly what he had hoped for without realizing it. Not compliance, not gratitude, but choice. And that alone shifted the nature of what he was offering from something given to something earned. And Clara's gaze did not waver as she added, "And if I do this, I do it the same way I did yesterday," she said, without expectation. And again, the room settled around that statement, because it defined something that could not be written into any contract, something that existed outside of structure. And Ethan allowed a faint shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but something close to approval, something that recognized not just the answer, but the way it was given. And he stepped slightly closer to the desk, placing one hand lightly against its edge, grounding the moment. "That is exactly why I am offering it," he said, his voice steady, because in that instant, there was no need to explain further, no need to justify. The alignment between what he saw and what she had shown was already complete, and Clara held his gaze for one more second, as if confirming that nothing else needed to be said, and then she gave a small nod, the same simple motion she had used from the beginning, and that was it. No dramatic acceptance, no visible shift in emotion, just a quiet decision. Made in the same way all her decisions were made, clearly, completely, and without unnecessary weight. And Ethan exhaled softly, a breath he did not realize he had been holding, because in a world where everything was negotiated, everything was measured, this had not been. This had been something else entirely, something that did not follow the rules he had built his life around, and yet somehow, it felt more certain than anything else he had agreed to in years. And as Clara stepped back, slightly, the folder still resting between them. No longer just an offer, but the beginning of something neither of them had planned. The room shifted once more, not in energy, not in tension, but in direction. Because what had started as a simple act had now become something larger, something that would not end when she walked out of the room, but would follow her forward, into a space where the rules were different, and where the quiet choices she made would continue to change things in ways no one could predict. Not even the man who had built his entire life on doing exactly that. The decision did not echo. It settled, quiet and complete, and within minutes, the structure of the day began to shift around it. Not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, but in small, precise movements that aligned themselves with something new. And Clara Whitmore stood once more near the same glass door she had entered through, the folder now held lightly in her hand, not gripped, not displayed, just carried as part of what came next. And the man who had escorted her earlier returned, his expression unchanged, but his tone slightly different, more measured, as if acknowledging a transition that had already taken place. "We will take you back," he said, and Clara nodded once, because there was still a shift to complete, a line to cross between where she had been and where she would begin. And as they walked back through the corridor, the same quiet space surrounded them, but this time, something in it felt less distant, not because it had changed, but because she had, not in who she was, but in where she now stood within it. And when the elevator doors closed again, carrying her downward instead of up, the motion felt different, not like a return, but like a repositioning, as if the ground she had started from was no longer exactly the same. And outside, the city had not paused. It had not noticed. Traffic still moved, people still rushed, conversations still overlapped in endless layers. And when the car pulled up once more near the restaurant, the same door opened, the same quiet gesture inviting her back into the space she had left only a short time before. But Clara did not step out immediately. She paused for just a second, her gaze moving across the street, taking in the familiar details, the worn edges of the sidewalk, the reflection in the glass, the ordinary rhythm of a place that had never asked anything more from her than consistency. And then she stepped out, her shoes meeting the pavement with the same steady sound, and the car pulled away without lingering, disappearing back into the flow of the city as if it had never been there at all. And Clara turned toward the restaurant, the door opening with the same soft chime as before, and inside, nothing had changed. Plates still moved, voices still carried. The manager still stood behind the counter with a look that tried to remain neutral but did not quite succeed. And as Clara walked back in, a few glances followed her, subtle, brief, curious. But she did not meet them. She did not respond. She simply returned to where she had been, placing the folder carefully in her locker before tying her apron once more, her hands moving with the same practiced precision. And within seconds, she was back on the floor, lifting a tray, refilling a glass, stepping into the rhythm as if she had never left. And yet something had changed, not in her movement, not in her tone, but in the direction that now existed just beneath the surface of everything she did. And as she passed a table near the window, sunlight catching briefly on the edge of a glass, she paused just long enough to adjust it into place, aligning it perfectly with the table. And in that small action, there was the same clarity, the same intention that had led her to pick up a wallet without hesitation, to step into a street without asking, to walk into a room where she did not belong and stand exactly as she was. And across the city, in a room far above the ground, Ethan Caldwell stood by the window once more, his gaze moving across the skyline. But his thoughts no longer entirely anchored in numbers or outcomes, because something had shifted in the way he measured value, not replacing what he knew, but adding to it, quietly, steadily. And for the first time in a long while, he was not thinking about what could be gained, but about what had already been given without being asked for, and how something so simple had altered the course of something so large. And neither of them spoke of it again that day, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer needed to be said to remain true. The next few days did not announce themselves as different, but they carried a quiet shift beneath everything Clara Whitmore did, a subtle change in direction that did not alter her pace, her tone, or the way she moved through the restaurant, but existed just beneath the surface, like a current running parallel to the one everyone else could see. And each morning she arrived the same way, tied her apron the same way, stepped into the rhythm of service with the same steady presence. But now, at the end of each shift, there was something waiting that had not been there before, something that extended beyond the familiar walls of polished wood and soft conversation. And it began simply, without ceremony. When she opened the folder again that evening in her small apartment, the quiet hum of the city filtering through the window as she sat at a narrow table, reading through the details with the same calm attention she gave everything else. The position, the expectations, the structure of a world that moved differently from the one she knew, faster in some ways, more controlled in others, and she did not rush through it, did not skim or assume. She read each line fully, understanding not just what it said, but what it implied, because for her, decisions were not made quickly, they were made clearly, and by the time she closed the folder, placing it neatly beside her, there was no visible reaction, no sign of excitement or doubt, just the quiet certainty that she had already chosen. And the following morning, when she returned to the building of glass and steel, this time by her own choice, the experience unfolded differently. Not because the building had changed, but because her presence within it had. And as she stepped through the lobby once more, the same cool air, the same polished floors, the same controlled movement of people surrounded her. But now, she did not follow someone else's lead. She walked forward on her own, guided by direction rather than instruction. And when she reached the desk on the upper floor, where her name had already been placed into a system that did not forget details, she was greeted not with curiosity, but with quiet acknowledgement, a badge handed to her, a simple object that marked a shift more significant than it appeared, and she accepted it without ceremony, attaching it with the same calm precision she applied to everything else. And the day began, not with a dramatic introduction, but with observation, sitting in a meeting room where voices moved quickly, decisions layered on top of one another, strategies formed in measured tones, and Clara listened. Not interrupting, not reacting, just taking in the structure of a space where words carried weight in a different way. And across the table, Ethan Caldwell noticed it again, the same stillness, the same presence that did not compete for attention but did not fade into the background either. And as the discussion continued, he realized something that had not been clear before, that what she brought into that room was not knowledge of systems or experience within that world, but something far more difficult to teach, the ability to see what mattered without being told, the same quality that had led her to pick up something others ignored, to act without hesitation, to choose without expectation. And that understanding settled quietly, not as a conclusion, but as a beginning, because while the others spoke, calculated, adjusted their positions within the conversation, Clara remained steady. And when she finally did speak, it was not to add more, not to impress, but to clarify. Something simple that had been overlooked, and the room paused, not dramatically, but just enough for her words to land, just enough for something small to shift within a larger structure. And in that moment, it became clear that what had started as a single act had not ended. It had expanded, moving from one space into another, carrying the same quiet clarity with it, changing not everything, but enough. And that was all it had ever needed to do. The days that followed did not announce themselves with dramatic change, but they carried a quiet transformation that could be felt in the smallest details, in the way Clara Whitmore moved through both worlds without losing herself in either, in the way she balanced a tray in the restaurant with the same precision she brought to a meeting room filled with executives, and over time, the distance between those two spaces began to narrow, not because they became the same, but because she remained the same within them. Steady, observant, grounded in something that did not depend on where she stood, and people began to notice, not all at once, not loudly, but gradually, in moments that could not be ignored, when a simple observation shifted a conversation, when a quiet question revealed a flaw others had overlooked, when clarity appeared where complexity had taken over. And in those moments, it was not her title that carried weight, it was her presence. The same presence that had once stopped in the middle of a crowded street for something everyone else had missed, and Ethan Caldwell saw it more clearly than anyone else, not as a surprise anymore, but as something consistent, something reliable, something that did not change based on pressure or expectation. And one evening, Long after the office had emptied and the city lights reflected softly against the glass walls, he stood once more by the window, the skyline stretching endlessly before him. But this time, his thoughts were not on risk or outcome or strategy. They were on something far simpler, something he had not considered in a long time. The idea that not everything valuable needed to be pursued, that some things arrived quietly, unannounced, and changed. Everything without asking for permission, and across the city, in a small apartment where the noise of traffic softened into a distant hum, Clara sat by the window with a cup of coffee in her hands, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady as she looked out at the same skyline from a different height, a different angle, and yet the view felt complete, not because of what had changed around her, but because of what had remained unchanged within her, and she did not think about the office in terms of status, nor the restaurant in terms of limitation. She saw both as places where choices were made, where actions carried meaning, where dignity was not something given by others, but something held quietly, consistently, without needing recognition. And that was what connected everything. Not the building, not the position, not the moment that had started it all, but the way she had chosen to act when no one was watching, and the way she continued to act even when everyone was. And somewhere between those two moments, something rare had formed, not a transaction, not an exchange, but a quiet alignment between who she was and what the world needed more of. And that was the part that stayed, long after the meetings ended, long after the tables were cleared, long after the city moved on to its next story, because some actions do not echo loudly, they settle deeply, changing the direction of things without ever announcing themselves. And if this story stayed with you, not because of what was gained, but because of what was chosen, then maybe you understand something most people overlook, that the smallest act, done without expectation, can carry more power than anything planned. And if you have ever made a choice like that, or seen one that changed something quietly but completely, you can share it, because sometimes the stories that matter most are the ones that remind us who we already are.